Hello and welcome to the NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Don. Welcome to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on cybersecurity maturity model certification and related cybersecurity topics. My guest today is Michael McLaughlin. I do want to mention to everyone that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is primarily on organizations that are seeking certification, and that's mostly who we have in our audience today. If you have some questions from the audience, please send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I will try to work those into my conversation with Mike. I'll start with a quick introduction. Lieutenant Commander McLaughlin, he's the Chief of Counterintelligence and Human Intelligence within U.S. Cyber Command's Cyber National Mission Force at Fort Meade, Maryland. He's held various positions within the U.S. Cyber Command, graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, and is currently a JD candidate at the University of Maryland, seeking to be a lawyer. Mike's background is in military intelligence and counterintelligence, specifically in the cyber domain. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ed.
So you had some technical difficulties, but we got the cell phone working, so I think we'll be good to go. You provided a keynote speech recently on the Cybersecurity Summit event that we sponsored with Federal Publication Seminars. That was on the 28th last week. Many of the topics that you raised in that speech seem valuable to our audience in this series. So I thought, maybe try to bring some of those topics up and have a little further discussion on them. Our adversaries have put together a pretty strong capability to attack us, and this includes non-state actors that are allowed to operate in Russia, China, elsewhere with some state protection, some impunity, if not direct support from the state. You describe this as being akin to sort of modern day privateering. How does the inclusion of those non-state actors change the battlefield? And can you elaborate on the privateering concept a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. As a naval officer, privateering and pirates are always near and dear to my heart. Let me begin first, as the good public servant that I am, that any views that I express here are my own. I'm here in a personal capacity and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Defense or U.S. Cyber Command. So, with that being said, privateering, it's interesting when you look at the history of privateering and the way in which it was used by both the British and the French to try to keep the Spanish from gaining too much power or trying to really to build off of the wealth that they were stealing from the New World to build their own fleets. And the parallels that we see right now with a lot of ransomware in particular, but a lot of the proxies that are being used in cyberspace, there is a very distinct characteristic that flows through all of them. And that is, it is an asymmetry that's trying to be that nation states are trying to capitalize on so that they can detract from a stronger nation with a stronger military in a way that they wouldn't normally be able to do. And really, that's what we're seeing. Now, you mentioned, how does that, from a legal perspective, how does that complicate the analysis? It is incredibly complicated, to say the least. If you look at just from the standpoint of utilizing proxies or privateers or ransomware actors, we saw this come up at the right after 9/11. When you look at international law, the UN Charter and international law generally doesn't apply to non-state actors, and so it doesn't really apply to terrorist groups. Doesn't really apply to ransomware actors because Article 2.4 in the UN Charter, it prohibits the threat or use of a force against another state, and it's really only applicable to UN member states. That doesn't prohibit a country or a nation from engaging in self-defense. And Article 51 of the UN Charter is very clear that if you are being attacked and there's an armed attack that's taking place, you can defend yourself, and that's not limited to defending yourself from nation states. And we've seen this play out after 9/11 with the invasion of Afghanistan, where the U.S. invaded Afghanistan under this theory of self-defense, which we essentially asserted that the nation of Afghanistan was harboring terrorists and that future attacks were anticipated, and only military action could deter them. So there is a precedent for conducting military activity. It's just really difficult when you're talking about cyberspace, because I think cyberspace is patently different. And despite many countries asserting that a breach of their network would violate sovereignty, there's really no accepted standard for what constitutes use of force in cyberspace. So if we were to take a self-defense action for something that occurred in cyberspace, very likely the US would be violating international law itself.
So the attacks we're seeing, they're bold, they're successful, they're getting a lot of public attention, but we don't see a lot of direct response. And I think, your point about the fact that we may not have a lot of recourse under international law without putting ourselves in jeopardy is a big deal. I mean, the things that are happening, they're definitely below the level of sort of armed conflict, but having an impact on national security. So beyond that legal, what other models of deterrence do you think we have to choose from? What's in our range of options, and what do you think would be most effective?
Yeah, well, I think when you look at I don't want to say beyond legal, because everything has to fall within some sort of legal framework, and that's what I talked about international law, and that really governs our use of force and the use of our military as a tool of statecraft, so to speak. But certainly, violations of our domestic law are also tools that we have, and that's what we've seen play out mostly against these types of criminal actors. The Department of Justice, most notably, that's one of the biggest things that we can do is indict the cyber actors. And we have. And I mean, going back to 2014 with APT 10, we have been doing the name and shame. And to a degree, it's worked, and to a degree, it hasn't. I mean, if you're a Chinese cyber actor who lives in mainland China and you're targeting the defense industrial base for espionage, the chances of you going to a country that has an extradition treaty with the United States is almost zero. Now, if you're a Russian cyber actor and you're in Moscow in the middle of winter, the Mediterranean's starting to look really good to you, it may be more effective there. And so in that case, you've got the Department of Justice that can use, Section 1030 of U.S. Code, which is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But there's also the Stored Communications Act, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, or the Wiretap Act, the various fraud and conspiracy charges that the Justice Department can use to go after these individuals. The problem is getting them to a place where we can actually extradite them, because otherwise it really is just a name and shame. Now, the problem isn't necessarily legal recourse. In that case, it really is the extradition. And that happens so rarely that it's almost, name and shame has also almost become laughable. But that's not really the only legal tool that we have at our discretion. And one of the most fascinating uses of the law that I've seen most recently, following Hafnium and the Microsoft Exchange server compromised by the Chinese cyber actors, the FBI utilized this little-known aspect of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure to remedy this compromise of private networks. So the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure is effectively what guides everything from the warrant process, but how does the Department of Justice, how does law enforcement engage in the prosecution of criminal activities? Well, one of those rules was updated in 2016, and for those attorneys who are interested, Rule 41(6)(b)(6). It allows a magistrate to issue a warrant for violation specifically of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, where law enforcement can go onto private networks and to preserve evidence. But when you're preserving evidence and you're talking about malware, you're removing that malware for evidence, but you're also removing the malware and you're cleaning the network. That's exactly what the FBI did. They went into, the numbers escape me, but a significant number of private networks to remediate them. And they removed the power shells that the Chinese cyber actors were using. So that specific tool is one that we have within our legal system that I think we could use a lot more. It's a challenge to get to that point because there's a whole warrant process that goes along with it. Now that was kind of a long way of saying there are still some legal tools that we haven't fully explored. But outside of that, I mean, we are doing a whole of government response where we have sanctions, we have demarches from the State Department. U.S. Cyber Command is certainly conducting operations. You have the military department counterintelligence organizations that are conducting collections and investigations. There is a whole of government effort to do this. The problem that we run into, though, is it's not yet at the point where it's a whole of society effort. And I think that's really where we need to be.
I think you're right. And I think, thinking about what the government's doing from a law enforcement or other deterrent effect, what they're asking us to do with the defense industrial base is, lay down some defenses, right? Take up defenses and be ready to ward these guys off, keep them away from our systems. So really, collective defense strategy, if you will. The executive order that the Biden administration put out earlier this year on cybersecurity, it put a lot of emphasis on the need for transparency, information sharing. Really, public-private information sharing was at the core of that. So some of it was government, intra-government, but a lot of it was making sure that the public sector, specifically DIB and other contractors, are part of that. How do we incentivize the private sector to participate in that sort of thing? How do we maximize the benefits of that from a perspective of our collective defense?
Yeah, I think the executive order, first of all, I think the executive order was groundbreaking in a lot of ways because really it made the federal government the standard bearer for cybersecurity. And it really put a lot of onus on the federal government to say, we are going to practice what we preach. From moving to the cloud-based environment to ensuring that we have effective managed cybersecurity providers to zero trust architecture. But throughout the whole lifespan of what is cybersecurity and what does that mean, the executive order really put that onus on the federal government and said, we are going to clean up our house. And now I think there's going to be a significant trickle down effect as a result of the executive order. And really what that means is, anybody who has a federal contract, not just with the DoD, but with any federal government organization is going to have to meet those standards. And so from a cloud computing perspective or from a managed cybersecurity perspective, those types of companies are going to have to adhere to the same standard when you're servicing government contractors as if you were servicing the federal government itself. And I think that's really where we're going to end up going, is that the DIB is 300,000 entities, and it's a massive, massive industry. Every single company within the DIB is going to be held to relatively a different standard. And we can talk about CMMC here in a little bit, the different levels and what does that really mean. But ultimately, there's going to be a baseline. And I think that executive order is the intent behind it is we need to establish a national baseline for what is acceptable cybersecurity and how are we going to implement it? How are we going to carry it out?
So you mentioned, a whole of industry, if you will, whole of the nation. And if we talk about that strong defensive stance and doing that in a collective way, we've really got to get that. We've got to get everybody playing, right? We've got to get that down to all levels, big companies, small companies, et cetera. And I think everybody who's looked at this, especially within the DIB, they all agree, even if they disagree with CMMC, they all agree that we need to do better at the small companies end of the spectrum. But we have to do that without imposing some economic or expertise burdens that those companies can't afford. So last week, John Sherman, new nominee for DoD CIO, he said in his testimony that he would update CMMC to be not onerous for small and mid-sized companies. He also mentioned working with NSA, US Cyber Command on a cybersecurity as a service model. So tell us a little bit more about that model, the cybersecurity as a service model, and the role of the DoD in shaping that kind of approach to support the defense industrial base.
So the DIB itself, and I love bringing home the number. It's like you talk about 300,000 companies. That is a significant portion of our economy, and it touches everything. Because a lot of it's not just government, but they're dual use technologies. Think about Boeing. And Boeing is going to make a ton of military grade equipment, a ton of jets. But they're also going to make commercial airliners. And so anything that's applicable to Boeing really is going to improve their commercial aspect of their business as well. So in that case, when we're talking about the DIB, I like the old cliche that a rising tide lifts all ships. And so if you can get the DIB to a certain standard, it's really going to improve the national cybersecurity. And I think that's ultimately where we're trying to go. And because of that, I think the DoD can be the principal driver behind cybersecurity standards and innovation for the country. The reason being is, the DIB and DoD has what other organizations and other sectors really don't, and that's the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, the DFARS. You have one supplement, one regulation that governs all of the contracts and all the contractual clauses that cover an entire industry. That's a huge stick. And so back in 2017, all DIB entities entering into or renewing contracts with the DoD were required to adhere to the NIST 800-171 special pub. That's 110 standards, comprise the bulk now of what is becoming the CMMC level 3 certification. I think there are 130 now standards that you have to meet for level 3 certification. So a lot of the companies should be already doing what the level 3 certification is requiring. And so I don't think that CMMC is overly onerous necessarily. I think it's a little convoluted in how it's coming out, in that there's not a whole lot of information. And certainly the assessors and how that process is going to work, I think that needs some refining, some clarification. But truthfully, what CMMC is saying is that the DoD is going to enforce what it's already put into the DFARS. And so I don't think it's going to necessarily be an increased burden on small businesses once we have a very clear way in which it's going to be rolled out. Now, the second part of your question was the cybersecurity. How does cybersecurity as a service model, what would that look like, and how would that be rolled out? And truthfully, US Cybercom and NSA, and then also you roll in CISA and you roll in the FBI and all the different organizations. And all the organizations have done joint notifications of significant issues, of threats, of vulnerabilities. They have worked with Microsoft to issue patches. And so the government is moving towards really, really doing its part in securing overall national cybersecurity. I don't necessarily think that Cybercom or NSA are ever going to get into the business of enabling a cybersecurity as a service where it's government sponsored. And again, this is Mike talking. This isn't, DoD or Cyber Command. But I don't think they are ever going to get there, nor do I think they should. And the reason being is you've got a lot of private networks, and it needs to be on the organizations to secure their own networks. Now, that being said, there is exquisite intelligence that the NSA has that the private sector just doesn't. The question becomes, how do you get that information downgraded to an unclassified level that can be shared widely to secure, every industry, to secure our national cyberspace? And I think when we get to that level, the cybersecurity as a model is going to become more of how do we more effectively share information between the government and the private sector, and vice versa, because it needs to be bidirectional. The government really can only do so much, rightfully so. We don't want the government necessarily reading email and getting into the content. And we have Fourth Amendment protections, which secure us against that. But at the same time, the government does need to see some of the information. I would say a lot of the information that's crossing the network. General Nakasone famously said in a testimony to Congress, our biggest problem, one of our biggest problems, isn't that we can't connect the dots; it's that we can't see the dots. And so that, and I think from a cybersecurity as a service model, I think it's going to be more of an information sharing, and how do we do that more effectively? That was a very long way to answer your question.
Appreciate it. I think there's a couple of audience questions I want to work in that kind of tie back to that, the burden, if you will. So this first one says it may not be an increased burden for current contractors who have met the NIST 171, right? So you mentioned that the lift is not large, but this is a huge hurdle for new contractors, right? Companies coming in that have never done this before, and I'll add my version to that audience question, or this is the lead into the question. Sorry, and even amongst those people who are currently contractors, many of them are not meeting those current requirements. So if you think of the lift, you really got to consider what they're doing, today that's not yet compliant. And that's the reason we have CMMC. So everybody's aware of it. It's not like it's only one or two companies out of the 300,000. So anyway, let's just stick with the new companies coming in, big burden. So this audience member says that limits the DIB to existing companies, reducing potential for innovation within the DIB. Anything to help new companies and new government contractors would help reduce this barrier. So yeah, do you see ways to make that easy for those entering in, where they've got to do all 130 controls from the ground up because they've previously been in the civil sector, or maybe they're a newly formed company?
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand the distinction between what is in existence today and what the CMMC, when it fully rolls out and we have that level 3 certification, what that's really going to mean. So the level 3 certification are those 130 standards, 110 of them are already in place. Realistically, if the DoD wanted to go back and go to every single, every bill that it had issued, or that had been issued to the government from companies that were not meeting the DFARS or the NIST 800-171 standard, they could go back and do that, and they could file charges under the as fraud effectively. Now, is the DoD going to do that? Absolutely not. That's not going to happen unless there's a significant whistleblower that calls it out. But companies who are in the DoD or that are in the DIB should already be doing this. And if they're not, then they're not adhering to their contractual obligations. So to say that it's going to be an increased burden, I think is a bit of a misnomer. It's going to be more of how is it now enforced? And I think the best way to do it, if we really want to increase innovation, because let's be honest, the DoD is largely stuck in a post-World War I mindset when it comes to acquisitions. And it is an incredibly onerous process, the whole bidding and contract process. Now, how do you make it so that cybersecurity is an added burden for that? I think that the best way to do it would be to create a marketplace of cybersecurity vendors who are accredited onto a certain CMMC level that can come into new companies that effectively there's a marketplace that these new companies would be able to select one of a number of cybersecurity vendors that would be able to come into their company and certify them and secure them to that specific level. Then it's not on an individual company that may have fewer than a dozen employees to dedicate, 4 or 5 IT workers or, information security personnel to doing that organically or in-house. I think if we have that sort of marketplace and have that sort of mentality where it's the government is imposing this new requirement, or the government is enforcing this requirement, I think having a marketplace that the government says validated, these are the vendors that can do this and that can get you to where you need to be at a reasonable price, I think that would resolve a lot of the issues, and I think it would make it a lot less burdensome upon the small and medium businesses.
I agree. And I think, one of the challenges today with small businesses is that the marketplace that exists right now is very confusing. It's not obvious what a good solution looks like. The vetting that you mentioned is not currently happening outside of cloud providers, right? So it's hard to tell, brilliant from deceptive. And there's been a lot of coalescing of vendors around CMMC. But yeah, there's not much sorted out, except again at the cloud, for cloud service providers, we can look to FedRAMP certification as, okay, well, I can tell which service providers have adhered to that and which ones have not. But that doesn't address the rest of the picture in putting together an IT footprint, which is typically a managed service provider or do it yourself. It's possible to take a very well-built FedRAMP compliant cloud service and do something horrible with it. So what do you think that the vetting process should look like in terms of, how do we create that kind of marketplace that you're talking about? Is it an expansion of FedRAMP or CMMC, or is it something else that we don't have yet?
I think it would have to be something else. And the reason I say that is because I think CMMC and FedRAMP are 2 discrete programs. One is entirely cloud-based, and it's how do we ensure that our cloud providers are up to a certain security or meet certain standards. CMMC covers anybody who's operating in the DIB, and it's enforcing those NIST standards. I think what we want is to say CMMC and FedRAMP require this level of standardization. Here is a tool by which you can do that, and here are the validated companies that you can go to achieve that. But I think it's even a broader question. This kind of ties back to the question you had earlier about what is cybersecurity as a service model. What would that look like? What could that look like? And I think if the government were to create a marketplace, for instance, and just like we are going to accredit under CMMC, we're going to accredit different levels for the different types of information that DIB entities are maintaining. I think we could have something very similar where you're saying that if you are a DIB entity, you can use the services of a select number or of any cybersecurity vendor that meets certain qualifications and that has been accredited by the government. With that sort of accreditation, what that would do is then exactly who you can go to. The price, it's going to be a competitive marketplace, and so it's going to keep the prices that the DIB entities are paying relatively low, but certainly constant, because it's going to be, from an economic standpoint, you're not going to have one company charging an arm and a leg and one company charging nothing.
No, economies of scale too with that model, right?
Exactly. And then you're also, what you're also doing is you're allowing new cybersecurity vendors to come into the marketplace to be competitive. Now, how do you improve that? How do you make it so that type of that marketplace is of value and that you're incentivizing those cybersecurity companies to come into it, but you're also making it so that it's not onerous and there's some value added for the DIB? Well, I think that's where that information sharing would really, or could really, come into play. The biggest problem is, how do you get information, data that's reflecting the threats to the DIB or activity on DIB networks or targeting of the DIB? How do you get that into the hands of our cyber operators, our government net defenders, our law enforcement? And right now, there isn't a real great solution. And the DFARS requires reporting to DC3. If you're in critical infrastructure, you have to report to CISO. There are a lot of different organizations, different reporting requirements. This is a model whereby if you had a select number, a discrete number of cybersecurity vendors that were validated to provide that type of security, that would certify companies to the CMMC level that they require, those companies could be the point through which that bidirectional information sharing would be passed. The added benefit of that is, if you have managed cybersecurity vendors who are validated in that marketplace servicing the DIB, they're also servicing the private sector. They're servicing other sectors of the government, or other sectors of the country, rather. And so if the federal government is sharing indicators of compromise or sharing signatures and threats with cybersecurity vendors, and they're getting that bidirectional information from the vendors themselves, again, it's a rising tide lifts all ships. That's improving national cybersecurity. It's not just improving the DIB. And so I think a marketplace of cybersecurity vendors that would accredit DIB entities and companies to a certain CMMC level that includes bidirectional sharing with the government, I think that's where we need to go.
I agree. I've got an interesting audience question related to this a little bit. So it says, as a small business in the defense sector, we're working to comply with CMMC level 3. This will divert internal IT professionals and dollar resources to complete all the requirements. How are we also expected to become part of the compliance machine, monitoring and measuring compliance throughout the hundreds of even smaller businesses within our supply chain? Any thoughts about that? I mean, CMMC helps that, right? Because you don't need to do your own assessment if somebody's third party's done it. So that's a piece of it, I think.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's one of the benefits of CMMC is it makes it so that the prime is no longer, the prime is still obviously responsible, but it makes it so the onus is not only on the prime to ensure that all the subcontractors are adhering to that same standard. The subcontractors have to be accredited to those certain levels, and if they're not, then they're not able to win the contract. And so I think a little bit of that removes some of the onus from the prime contractor, which is a good thing. But the point is well taken. It's how do we ensure that we're not putting an overly onerous burden upon our contractors, and we're not making it so that it's an economic burden, a manpower resource burden. How do we ensure that we are putting in effective cybersecurity in such a way that it's not stifling innovation and it's not preventing companies from entering into the DIB marketplace, so to speak. And that's a challenge. I think, again, this comes back to the marketplace. This comes back to outsourcing certain research, certain responsibilities when it comes to cybersecurity to manage vendors and manage providers who are themselves accredited or who are able to accredit a company to a certain level for CMMC specifically. I think that's where we need to go. And if we're able to get to that point, then the onus is no longer on the company itself, but it's shared with that certified vendor.
Mm-hmm. I think that notion of inheritance is very important to get the economies of scale we need. And I think, the inheritance has not been formally discussed yet. There's been discussion of inheritance from ISO 27000 and from FedRAMP, et cetera. So we know some of that's in the works. But I think for us, for instance, at NeoSystems as a service provider, our expectation is that once an auditor has looked at our services and said that those are okay and meet the CMMC standards, and we've got that third-party validation, that all of our clients should be able to inherit that for the things that we're doing for them. And that may not be everything, right? I mean, they may have some pieces, they will have some pieces that they've kept themselves that still need to be looked at. But the idea is that streamlines the process for them, right? So maybe 85, 95% of the things that are specific to that company are inherited. So that makes the process very easy, and I think hopefully much cheaper. So that's the promise. And I think so that's again, it's been talked about but not yet delivered. So we'll see how that comes out as we see some of these tweaks that are expected soon. One last question. We're kind of near the end of our time, so I just want to ask kind of a wrap-up question. I always like to leave people with some call to action, right? So for those in our audience today that want to take some actions to help build this collective defense, as you've watched the response to the DIB to these threats that we've seen recently, what are some of the best things you've seen in terms of these are the right kind of responses, people taking effective action that does, sort of raise the tide as you talk about?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the I think the standard government response. It's you got to report. And it's if you are keeping information and you're concerned about how it's going to look to shareholders or how it's going to look to clients, really you're doing a disservice to national security, especially if you're in the DIB. Trying to keep breaches quiet is one of the hardest things that we have to overcome. They're really there's no such thing as indemnity when it comes to this type of thing. So I recommend report as early as possible, certainly as early as you're required to, depending on the sector that you're in. Engage with your legal counsel and have them assist you in guiding you through it. And then when you're approached by the FBI or by the NSA or Cybercom or whomever and requesting information sharing, the best way that we can secure our national cybersecurity is to ensure that our cyber operators and our law enforcement personnel have the right information in their hands so that they can get after the bad guys. It's the bottom line is we need to do a better job of sharing information.
Appreciate it, Mike. Thank you very much. Anyone who is interested in hearing the entirety of the keynote speech Mike did at our Cybersecurity Summit last week, we have that available on demand. So you can visit our website, neosystemscorp.com, or you can email us at growahead@neosystemscorp.com. Either way, get the link to the on-demand version of that Cybersecurity Summit. There's a lot of other interesting stuff there as well, cyber mafia and a few other topics beyond Mike's excellent speech. So thank you, Mike, for joining us today. Thank you, Wade Forbes, for doing the real-time sketch noting of this event. We will send that sketch note that you can see on the screen. We'll send that out to the attendees after we get it wrapped up. Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today. Please join us for future town hall meetings. We are going to be taking a break next week because we have Veterans Day holiday, which is shortening up the week. The next session will be next session will be Wednesday, November 17th at 1 o'clock Eastern, our regular time. Head to neosystemscorp.com if you don't already have the details. Thank you very much.